Cast out as Barren, she bore the quiet rancher twins within a single year. The deed was in my coat pocket the morning they brought her to the edge of my property and left her there. Not my problem, my neighbor Cass Holloway told me, when I rode past his fence line and saw the woman standing in the ditch with a cloth bag at her feet and a bruise along her jawline that somebody had put there deliberately. Not his problem. He'd watched her stand there for going on 2 hours, he said. He figured she'd move along. I didn't say anything to Cass. There wasn't much to say to a man like that. I turned my horse and rode back toward the ditch. Her name was Adeline. That's what she told me when I pulled up alongside her and looked down. She didn't ask for help. Didn't flinch from the horse either, which told me something. She looked up at me with dark, level eyes and said her name like it was a fact I might need and not an appeal. No crying. No explaining. Just Adeline and then silence and the bag at her feet. I said I had a spare room and a stove going and she could come up to the house and warm herself, and she could decide from there what she wanted to do. That was all I offered. She picked up the bag and walked alongside the horse the 1/4 mile to my door, and she never asked me a single thing about who I was or what I wanted in return, and I took that to mean she was either too tired to care or she'd already weighed it and decided the risk was worth taking. Both turned out to be true. My name is Elias Croft. I've run this ranch since I was 27 years old, 41 years on the same stretch of grass and clay, long enough to have buried a wife in the east corner of the property under the 2 cottonwoods, long enough to have watched my nearest neighbors go under or sell off or just disappear. I'm not a man who talks much. I do the work and I go inside and I eat what I cook and I sleep and I get up and I do it again. I wasn't unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't some broken man pining in the dark. I had my land, I had the horses, I had the cattle, and I had my routine. But there was a stillness in that house by then that sat on the chest some mornings when I woke up, the way silence will do when it's gone on too long. I didn't let myself think about it much. No use. So that's who I was the morning I found Adeline Marsh, standing in the ditch on Cass Holloway's fence line, with a bruised jaw, and a cloth bag and nobody in the world who seemed to consider her their problem. I made coffee and she sat at my table and drank it and didn't say much. I made eggs. She ate them. I asked if she was hungry again and she said no thank you. I asked if the bruise needed looking at and she said it didn't. And then she looked at the table for a moment and then at me and she told me where she'd come from. She'd been married 4 years to a man named Dearborn over in the Sulphur Creek settlement. A big man, well regarded, with property and standing, and a voice in how things were done. In 4 years she had not gotten with child, and the women of the settlement had started to say the word that follows a woman like a curse once it gets spoken. Barren. She heard it first from Dearborn's mother, then from others, and finally from Dearborn himself, who was not a cruel man by nature but who had swallowed what was said around him until he believed it. He hadn't struck her. The bruise was from his brother, who had a shorter fuse, and had decided she had no claim on the house or the property since she'd given nothing to either. Dearborn had not stopped him. She said all of this the way you say facts, not like she was asking for sympathy, and not like she was asking me to judge any of them. She said it the way a person states what happened when they want the listener to have the information, without having to carry their grief about it. I said I was sorry. She nodded once. I told her the room was hers as long as she needed it. She thanked me. I told her there was work around the property if she wanted to earn her keep, and she said she would, and she did harder and more steadily than most hired hands I'd had come through. She could mend fencing. She could haul. She could handle a horse with more confidence than most men twice her size. She cooked in the evenings without being asked, and left the kitchen clean, and did not try to make conversation out of things that didn't need conversation. We fell into a rhythm in about 3 days, the way 2 quiet people sometimes can, and the house stopped sitting on my chest in the mornings. I want to say this plainly because I think it matters. I did not bring her in because I wanted something from her. I brought her in because she was standing in a ditch and nobody else was going to. I've spent my life on this land trying to do the right thing by it and by the people who came across it, and sometimes the right thing is just, you see a woman in a ditch with a bruised jaw in the cold, and you stop. That's all it was at the beginning. But things don't always stay what they started as. The first sign that something had shifted between us was small, and I almost missed it. It was a Saturday, maybe 5 or 6 weeks after she arrived, and I was at the far pasture trying to work a fence post back into ground that had heaved with frost, and I'd been at it for going on 2 hours and the post still wasn't right, and I heard hooves behind me and turned, and it was Adeline on the gray mare with a mallet across her saddle, and a look on her face that said she'd watched me fight that post long enough and had decided to come help. She didn't ask. She rode up alongside, got down, planted her feet, and held the post steady while I drove it. Didn't say a word about it afterward, just remounted and rode back toward the house. Something about that, the way she did it without waiting to be invited, without making it into something, I thought about it that night for a while. There were other things. The way she listened when I talked, which wasn't often, but when I did she gave it her full attention like she was storing it away. The way she handled the horses, firm and patient in equal measure, the way a person is when they have no fear. The way she'd stand at the window in the evening watching the land go dark, and her face in those moments was not sad exactly but waiting. The way you look at something you've started to feel is yours and haven't finished believing it yet. I was 63 years old. I had land and cattle and a quiet life, and I had not thought in years about whether there might be more of something. I'd buried my wife 11 years prior, me, who I had loved steadily and quietly for 22 years, and after she passed I'd closed certain doors and gone on with the work. Not out of grief only. Just, there comes a point where you stop expecting. You accept the shape of things. Adeline Marsh was changing the shape of things, and I noticed it the way you notice weather coming in, not all at once, but in small signs that add up until you can't pretend you don't see it. I didn't act on it for a long time. Part of that was not wanting to mistake gratitude for something else. She was in my house because I had helped her and she had nowhere else to go, and I was not going to be the man who confused that situation with something it wasn't. I kept my distance and I kept my word, and the days went by. What changed, it was a night in late November. We'd had a bad day. A heifer had gone down in the south field, infection in the leg that had been there longer than I'd caught it, and by the time I understood what I was dealing with it was too late. I'd had to put her down myself in the late afternoon, with the sky going gray and the cold coming in hard, and I'd come back to the house covered in mud and blood, and exhausted in the way that goes past the body. Adeline had seen me come in and she hadn't said anything, just poured water for me and set out clean clothes and put a plate on the stove. I sat at the table after and didn't eat and didn't talk, and she sat across from me with her coffee and didn't push. That was something I'd already noticed about her. She had no impulse to fill a silence that didn't need filling. She let me be. After a while she said, quietly, that she was sorry about the heifer. She said she'd watch me try to save her for 2 days. I said sometimes, you can't catch a thing early enough. She said she knew about that. She wasn't talking about the heifer anymore, and we both knew it, and I looked across the table at her and she looked back at me, and there, it was just plain and clear between us without either of us having done anything to arrange it. I hadn't felt anything like it in 11 years. I didn't trust it completely, but I didn't look away. I said to her, I want to ask you something, and I want you to feel free to say no without it changing a thing between us. She said she was listening. I said I'd been thinking about whether she'd consider staying, not as a hand and not as a tenant, as my wife. The room was very quiet, the stove ticked. She looked at me for long enough that I started to think I'd read it wrong, and she was finding a way to be kind about it. Then she said, and her voice was very steady, she said, I should tell you what they told you I was. I said I knew what they called her. She said, I can't promise you I'm not. I said, I'm not asking for a promise on that. I'm asking if you want to stay and be here with me and be my wife. The rest of it's not a condition." She was quiet another moment, then she said yes. We were married by the circuit preacher 8 days later at the ranch with only 2 witnesses, a hand named Domingo who'd worked for me 12 years, and a woman from town called Frances Birch who'd been me's friend and had known me long enough to understand what this meant. Frances cried a little. I didn't. Adeline stood beside me in a blue dress she'd made herself in those 8 days and held my hand during the words, and when it was done, she looked up at me with those dark, level eyes, and she squeezed my hand once, firm and deliberate, the way you signal something that doesn't need saying out loud. I squeezed back. The winter was a hard one. We worked through it together and the house was not still anymore, and at night there was a warmth in it that I had almost forgotten was possible. I don't mean anything soft by that. I mean the actual warmth of 2 people who work the same ground and share a table and go to sleep under the same roof and know that the other one is there. That warmth. It doesn't ask for much. It asks only that you earned it. In the spring, Adeline missed her time. She told me on a Tuesday morning at the table. Matter of fact, the way she said everything, but her hands were folded on the table in a way that told me she'd been sitting with it for a while before she spoke. She said she didn't want to say it yet in case it didn't hold. She said she needed me to know, though. I sat down across from her. I said, "I'm glad you told me, and I'm not holding my breath either direction." She nodded, her jaw was tight. I said, "Whatever comes from this, you're my wife and you're not going anywhere, and that's the only part that matters." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was something in her face that I don't have the language for exactly. Something that a woman who has been told she has no value looks like when someone offers her a different story and she starts to believe it. Not gratitude. Something harder and more permanent than gratitude. Something like, "You are the one." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and held it there. Her hand was rough from work, the knuckles a little reddened from the cold water and the fence work, and all the things she'd thrown herself into on this ranch. I covered her hand with my other hand, and we sat there like that for a minute in the morning quiet. It held more than held. By midsummer she was visibly showing, and the women in town had started to understand what that meant. Frances Birch was the one who came out to see us and stood on the porch and looked at Adeline with an expression that was somewhere between wonder and satisfaction and said, "Well, I suppose we know now what the trouble was." Adeline smiled at her. It wasn't a small smile. The doctor came out from Hender's Crossing in September, a long-faced man named Prout who had delivered half the children in the county, and he examined her and came back into the kitchen where I was waiting, and he stood in the doorway and he said, "Mr. Croft, you'd better brace yourself." I said, "Why, is something wrong?" He said, "Not a thing in the world, except there are 2 of them." I sat down in the kitchen chair. 2? Prout said it was not unheard of. He said she was healthy and the pregnancy was progressing without complications, and he had no concerns. He said I looked like I needed a glass of water, and he was probably right. Adeline came out from the back room a few minutes later and saw my face and asked me what he'd said. I told her. She stood very still for a moment. Then she made a sound I had never heard from her before, not a cry, not a laugh, something between the two that she had clearly not intended to make out loud, and she put her hand over her mouth. I got up and crossed the room and put my arms around her, and she let me hold her for the first time the way she never quite had before, her whole body leaning into mine, her face against my shoulder, and she was shaking a little with whatever that sound had been, and I held her and felt the weight of her against me and thought, "This is mine. This woman and whatever comes next, and this land and this life, it's mine and I earned it, and nobody is going to tell me otherwise." I want to tell you about the day they were born, because I think it's the day I understood something I'd been circling for a long time. It was October, a cold, still morning with frost on the grass, and the sky just starting to go from black to blue. Prute was there and Francis was there, and Domingo had ridden for them in the dark. I was not in the room. They told me to stay in the kitchen, and I stayed in the kitchen, and I sat with my hands on the table, and I listened to the sounds coming from the back, and I did not allow myself to think about anything except the next minute, and then the one after that. The first cry came around 6 in the morning. Then the second. Prute opened the door after a while, and he was smiling, really smiling, which I'd never seen from him before. And he said both of them were here and both of them were good, and Adeline was asking for me. I went in. She was lying back against the pillow with her hair loose and her face spent and pale, and she was holding one of them, wrapped up, red-faced, furious at the world the way all newborns are, and Francis was holding the second. Adeline looked up at me when I came in, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "Come look." I came and stood beside her and looked down at the one in her arms. Tiny, impossible, a hand about the size of my thumb curled up against a cheek. I said, "What do you want to call them?" She said she'd been thinking on it. She said she wanted to call the boy Samuel. She said she wanted to call the girl Me. I had not told her Me's name, not once. I looked at her. She held my eyes and said, "Francis told me. She said I'd want to know. And I do want to. I want them to carry that name, if it's all right." I couldn't speak for a moment. I just stood there with my hand on the frame of the bed and looked at my wife and my son and thought of Me over in the east corner under the cottonwoods and thought, she would have been glad. She would have been so glad. I said, "It's more than all right." Adeline reached up with her free hand and took hold of my wrist, not gently, the way you take hold of something you are not letting go of, and she looked at me and her voice was quiet and plain, and she said, "You gave me back something I thought was gone. I won't forget it." I put my hand over hers the way I had at the kitchen table that spring morning, and I stood there with my wife and my son, and my daughter named Me in that cold October room with the frost on the glass and the light coming up outside, and I thought, this is what it is to be a man who held on, who didn't fold when the land went hard and the house went still, who stopped for a woman in a ditch and did the right thing and kept doing it without asking what he'd get back. I thought, you get this back. If you're lucky and you stay steady and you do the work, you get this. Samuel is 11 now. Me is 11. They've grown up on this ranch the same way I did, with the same clay under their boots and the same sky overhead, and they know how to work, and they know the land will ask everything of you, and that's all right, because it gives back in equal measure if you treat it right. Adeline is still here. Of course she is. That was never a question after the first week, though I didn't know it then. She runs the east pasture better than I ever did, and she can still outride most of the hands I bring on. And in the evenings she sits at the table and she looks at our children, and sometimes she looks over at me with those dark, level eyes, and something passes between us that has been passing between us for more than a decade now, and has never once needed a word. People in town know the story. Not all of it, some of it's ours and it stays ours, but enough. They know a woman was cast out from one place and found her ground in another. They know what those children are. They know Elias Croft, who kept to himself for years on that ranch, is not quite so alone anymore. Cass Holloway died 3 winters back, drank himself to ruin after his cattle operation failed. I went to his funeral because that's what you do, and I stood at the graveside and I thought about that morning. He'd watched Adeline stand in the ditch for 2 hours and said it wasn't his problem. I thought, no, it wasn't. It was mine. And I am a man who is grateful, every morning I wake up on this land, that I understood that. The cottonwoods in the east corner have gotten bigger. I go out there sometimes in the early morning before anyone else is up, just me and the grass and the sound of the cattle moving somewhere further off, and I stand by Me's marker, and I talk to her the way I have for 22 years. I tell her about Samuel and about Me the younger, who has her grandmother's name now and her own face and her mother's directness, and who will run this ranch someday better than I ran it. I tell her about Adeline. I think she'd say, good, I think she'd say, you did right, Elias. I was quiet too long after you went. I held the land and I held on, and eventually the right thing came across the fence line and I stopped for it. That's all. That is entirely all. And it turned out to be enough.